A 23-year-old flight instructor, is that you? I said, yes, a half a century ago. So years do take their toll, and we were not going to be here forever, so why not nail it down so somewhere, somehow, somebody might understand how we are where we are. I just am so full of so many incidences, as Jane said. Lorna, I do hope, is here because she's the one who's really nailed some very pristine, special moments. I've come up through the ranks in a very slow-paced progression of interesting activities that carried on with a more rather normal lifestyle. But I think when Kathy mentioned about how, actually I showed Bill Pepler a paper that his wife Isabel wanted me to hand in my own autobiography when my chapter was sponsoring me, paying the bill to get me inducted into the Forest of Friendship in Atchison, Kansas. It's dedicated to Amelia Earhart's hometown, and there's about 1,200 people there now who are aviation-oriented, like going way back to everybody and anybody, and here's Felicity Bennett McKendry there now, thanks because of dedicated interest in aviation. But Isabel asked, would I write my own autobiography? And I thought, my first line is, how did a kid, southeastern Ontario, dairy farmer, mixed farming, get into aviation? That really started the winding up. And my sister's here in the front row, and she's 3 years senior, but when I asked her, do you remember Captain Sparks and Orphan Annie program, Connie? Can you say you do or don't you? Captain Sparks and Orphan Annie? Yeah. Well, she never sat with me, but that was one thing that really I come to my now. And there on the table is the very first simulator, cockpit simulator. Do you see it there? The paper cardboard, and Spence, my husband's name is on that envelope. I sent for one at age 12, Spencerville, Ontario, 50 miles south of Ottawa. It was sometime after we were married. Mine is long disintegrated from out of worn out. Here is this envelope, Spence McKendry, Glen Burnie, Ontario. He had sent for the very same thing, and we both. Well, I would tear home from school at 4 o'clock, 4:30 on the radio. A child's mental ability is much better than television. There'd be this Orphan Annie and Captain Sparks, and I forget, once a week maybe, there would be a 3-minute flying lesson at the end of their little story. And you'd set your cockpit up on your chair, and you'd sit there and you'd do everything, and you'd set the dials on it, and you'd read the book, and they would put on a record of sound effects, and you'd be doing turns, you'd be doing takeoffs and landings. Well, when I had my first flight lesson with George Huron in 1950, December, in a Fleet Canuck in Kingston Flying Club, he taxied out and we came back in. He said, have you had previous lessons? I said, no. Well, I think the simulator paid off. But where that desire came, it's an addiction almost, but there it was. And Connie built model airplanes too, but she was my first passenger once I did get my license, but not overly aviation enthused, I guess, but appreciates what airplanes do. Okay, then that was public school, on into high school, and if you look around, the papers are up around there. When Jane said she was going to document these things, I thought, my word, these boxes of stuff. I went through them and I thought, okay, there's a letter written my final year high school to Glenn White, Hamilton, Cub dealer. How does a girl get into aviation? Well, maybe you can go to secretarial school and get a job in the office. I went to teachers college because I got a scholarship, but by that time I was now 5'9½", and at that time I wanted to be an airline steward. It was 5'6" was the max height back then. I did not go into nurses training because of that, because you had to be a nurse. I wish I had still gone nursing training, but then I went to school teaching and almost my first money. Some of it went into membership at the Kingston Flying Club. And thereon started my lessons. George Huron was my first instructor, and shortly after he left to become the chief head of the Royal Canadian Flying Clubs Association. And Doug Wagner then became my full-time instructor and carried on. And by September, that was December, and the summer holidays, teachers have holidays, and then getting back to school in September, I made a push to get my license finished that August and achieved that. And I did well, I guess, proved I could do things that had to be done. And then the following year, I was encouraged to enter the Webster Trophy representing the Kingston Flying Club. And I thought, oh, okay, down at Hawkesbury. And that is where I first met Lorna deBlicquy. Lorna Bray. She was representing the Ottawa Flying Club. And that year, there's a picture around somewhere, actually there were 7 candidates in the St. Lawrence trials at Hawkesbury, 4 girls and 3 guys. So that says something about the evolution of females into aviation, I think. And as I mentioned, I achieved good marks on the flying, but I did not have much navigation exercise. And 15-degree change of direction was, I overcorrected. But anyway, that was good experience. Okay, on we go. And then Doug Wagner opened the door for me, and I feel ever in debt to him because I did not have that chase to get a job. I was teaching. I'd got my license. Doug's assistant instructor was leaving in the spring to go bush flying. And if I could have my commercial license and instructor's rating by May the following spring of '53, I would have a job. Well, I resigned my teaching position at Christmas, and I did a crash course in time factor, not any other way. On April the 29th, I completed all the requirements by doing my test for my instructor's rating. And actually, again, George Hearn picked me up in Kingston with Doug Edwards from the Ottawa Flying Club and somebody else. We flew to Toronto. Mo Louch was the chap who did my ride in Toronto. And was just asking Bill Pepler if Mo is still around or not, but he's too busy traveling, I guess. But he actually did my private pilot's flight test in Kingston. And this is really antiquated because back then, how many can relate to the fact the inspector sat on the ground, you went over what you were to do, you went up over the airport to 3,000 feet plus, did this, that, the other thing, and then my instructions were to do turns left, right, and do a spin to the right, and then do a dead stick landing back on the airport. Of course, much lighter traffic in those days. Well, there were about 5 or 6 other candidates that morning, and Mo was there, and I said, well, can I be last? I wanted to observe what the others did or how it was done, because I was very little around the airport. So I was about coming up noon hour when I went. I went up to 3,000 feet. Fleet Canuck, Delta, Quebec, November. It did not like to spin to the right. I tried, and I tried. 3 times. It would not go, so I said, oh, to heck with it. And I did it, and did my landing back in the field. And I said, some aircraft are rigged slightly differently, and some of them just are not good to do spin in the opposite direction. Oh. He said, I thought you were going to be up there all day. He was getting kind of anxious about his lunchtime. So. Okay, so the next time I meet Mo is doing my instructor's ride in Toronto, and crossed paths with him off and on. He's just a great fellow. Well, Doug did encourage me to get my license, and by that time I did fill the bill, and was at the Kingston Flying Club 53 till 56. And in that interim, a certain student came along and, well, Doug said, why don't I ever fly with Spence? Spence would book bookings when I was on duty, and Doug did get flying with him. Okay. Anyway, he's a great guy. And anyway, we were married in October of '55. That was well, but you'll see one picture around it in the wedding, and we're looking up at the sky, and here is a chipmunk overhead doing aerobatics, kind of serenading. In Merrickville, Ontario was the wedding, and the chipmunk was part of the training at Kingston because the ROTP, Reserve Officer Training Program for the ex-military. At that time, the Cold War was in full force, and they wanted to have a reserve of instructors ready if needed. So the duty of the Kingston Flying Club was to take these former Air Force pilots, train them to their flight test standards for their instructor's rating, and they would provide a Chipmunk aircraft. There's a picture over there, I think, on the wall. So that was a super time because that's when I learned some aerobatics. Fly, giving them instructor pattern, and then on the way back to the airport, they teach me a roll or they teach me a loop. That was great. So Spence gets accepted by the very first course out there because stories intertwine. Doug said, well, yeah, air traffic control, that would be a good job if you, but honestly, only 15% of the general population, I understand, has a proper natural aptitudes to see things in that three-way, whatever it takes. And I think Spence was in that 15% because out of the first application for the very first course that Transport Canada offered in November of 1955, he was in the first 30 out of 500 applicants. Well, we were on our honeymoon. We had to decline that one, so we went in February of '56, and I left Kingston, fond memories, and we went to Toronto, ATC, and thereafter we've always been around airports. So my career, I was now a CF Class 2 instructor, so that's when we came to Ottawa. Russ Bradley, I got hired there, CFI, with Russ Bradley, another interesting individual, and ended up, actually we had to take a break and settle some family business in Kingston, so then came back a couple of years later and in Ottawa now full-time. I then worked for Margaret Carson. I met Margaret, I knew her through the 99s, but also knew her because while I was, quote, building time to get this instructor's rating completed, Doug Wagner, I think I stayed at my aunt and uncle's who lived happily near the Kingston airport. And I could just walk over. And a Sunday night, I think it was, I get a call from Doug Wagner saying, Margaret Carson is flying to Washington in her Stinson tomorrow to go down to AOPA to visit them about starting up Canadian Owners and Pilots Association just to get the groundwork ready. Would I like to go? Okay, I was up and ready, willing to go. So I flew as a passenger with Margaret in the Stinson, doing what airplanes are meant to do, go cross-country, right to Washington, Bethesda, Maryland. So I stayed with Margaret in that one clip there, Spencerville girl west flies to Washington, I think it's one of these Prescott Journal little clips. But Margaret really, I got to know her quite well as a very dear friend, but she, at that time, I was really to build in 200 hours within January to April. It's a short day. I thought, well, I'd rather go round and round Kingston. Let's go somewhere. So my aunt lived in Florida, and Margaret Carson put me together with Betty McCants. Do any of you relate to that name? She was one of the initial 99 chapter members. She worked for Transport Canada as a secretary, had her private license. Anyway, Margaret put me on to Betty, so Betty and I did a flying trip to Florida and back. So I appreciate Margaret's input there, and thereafter, when I got back into and Lorna did my re-ride to get my instructor's rating back after a bit of a lapse out of the Ottawa Flying Club, and I'm not sure, I don't think I asked Margaret for a job, I think she asked me. I worked for Margaret for a year at Ottawa Aero Services. At that time, 74, Rockcliffe Flying Club, I got started there. And that was where I really kind of spent the rest of my flying time in Rockcliffe. It, again, was a wonderful experience because so many private owners, and yet the student body was the one thing that kept the club going. And this is a big issue. I know clubs, to keep the training aspect up is what often keeps the club going, and yet all these club owners own airplane. It's a big trade-off all the time. How it's going to be resolved is hard to say. But at that time, I think it was mentioned, Bjarne Tryggvason was on the ground school course teaching at the Rockcliffe Flying Club. He's one of the Canadian astronauts. At that time, all the astronauts were over at Rockcliffe. They're down at St. Hubert, or they're all down Quebec anyway. But at that time, the whole group of the initial Canadian astronauts were at Rockcliffe. And they had their own aeroplane, a Cessna 172. Bjarne Tryggvason also had his instructor's rating, so he was their instructor. So he taught Mark Garneau, Steve McLean, all the other. Roberta Bondar already had her license, so she wasn't involved in this. But came time, they were flying under the Rockcliffe Flying Club's envelope, and I was a designated flight test examiner. So lo and behold, June the 26th, 1986, Mark Garneau's flight test is booked on the day of Spence's retirement party. So, yeah, I said, well, that's fine, great, because I'd done Steve McLean's, but what a pleasure and what a great guy to be where he is, to see people, put space across to people. Mark Garneau he took that flight test so seriously, he did exceptionally well. And there was another guy there coming up, just an ordinary student who was doing very well. And I said, I hope the other guy, Bill Thompson, I think his name was, I hope he gets the high marks, because you don't know until the marks from the flight test come in, plus the written exams, the total. Mark Garneau beat him out by 0.5%, so he got the best award for that year among all the other accolades that he received. But no, he took it very seriously. And to share with you what recall of places and people he has with everything else that's on his plate. Sometimes later in Kingston, after we moved back to Kingston, 86, 88, our neighbors in the condominium we were, their great niece is now married to Mark. So Mark was coming in to speak to the Canadian Club in Kingston. And they thought it would be neat for Spence and me just to be down in their apartment when Mark walked in the door. They didn't know we were going to be there like 12, 15 years later after, how many years? Mark walked in the door, and there I am. He said, Felicity, Spence, does Harold still have his airplane? Just recall, on the spur of the moment, I thought. And then in today's newspaper, again, he's trying to promote the thought of Mars, get stuff ready for Canadian expertise to be available for Mars, you know. He's with it there all the way. So you meet some amazing people. I'm hodgepodging here. And again, I'm dropping back to the Royal Canadian Flying Clubs used to have their annual meeting in the Chateau Laurier. The Legless Ace Botter was the special speaker that year. We from Kingston went down, about 4 of us, and heard him. And I happened to be in the elevator going up. And there's Douglas Botter, William T. Piper, myself, and my uncle. Wow. But that's the kind of the references of people and they were amazed that I was getting my instructor's rating. You know, so just these flashes come. Okay, I'm just going to, the refresher courses were great in that when I got my instructor's rating on April the 29th, 1953, the instructor course in Brantford was starting on May the 4th. And Angus Morrison, well, somehow I got slotted in to go to this instructor's course. And what a nice transition from being a student all these years to getting to sit in the other seat. So I was one of those pictures out there, the only girl among these 30 guys doing this instructor's course. Well, that that was great. They made special arrangements, and you have your special hotel room. And you are a bit of an expense when you have to provide one special room for one person. But they accommodated me very well. But that was a good transition, and on it went. And long hours. I never felt I was really being worked, but my mother used to say, well, when do you get holidays? Well, it was all a holiday, really, but it was 8 in the morning maybe earlier, but till 10 o'clock later when ground school is finished, like 10, 12-hour days quite often. So it really was built time, built experience, just wonderful time. And in the course of this, then you build up experience through Class 1 rating, the DFTE. And then Bill Paris replaced George Huron as head of the Royal Canadian Flying Clubs Association. And the Governor General's Shield, candidates from all the flying clubs across Canada, there used to be 28 of them that were, at that time, the core of the flying community. They each would put a candidate up to win the Governor General Shield Cup. And they needed someone to inspect or judge these candidates. So in 1982, Bill Paris asked if I would do that. It meant trucking across Canada, and by getting special permission and freebies from the airlines, anyway, it happened. And I did that in 82, but I think maybe, I don't know if there was another one in 83 or not. It was just kind of waning at that time, and I don't know the end of that story. But I'm just, oh my goodness. Then came in these air races. How did they happen? The 99s, I got my license, and I joined the 99s as soon thereafter. Do you know what, anybody doesn't know what 99 stands for? Someone asked me this morning. I said, okay, I'll answer you as well, because someone said innocently, well, what's it mean? Well, in 1929, and I'll say my birthday year, I'm as old as the 99s, but there was one lady, Fay Gillis Wells, who wrote a letter to all the licensed pilots at that time in the United States, 120 of them. She wrote a letter. Let's meet, get some support for each other at New Jersey in November. 99 of them appeared. Amelia Earhart was named their first president. She said, let's call ourselves the 99s. So that's, and the husbands are 49 and a halfers. Student pilots are 66ers. So they're not quite there, but they're coming. So the 99s have been a great part of, because of the being often the sole girl around so many flyers. But honestly, the one picture I'm proud of, there were 5 of us at the Kingston Flying Club that keen flyers and sport each other well. But the I have spent a lot of energy and effort because, well, Sue Beggs is our current chair here, and Dorothy Berthollet has done a wonderful job of putting the local chapter on the map. But they're a great group, very supportive. But I think through that organization, girls are now captains on airlines. Just, it's not uncommon. But I think the door was opened by the 99s. And again, I come back to the fact that Doug Wagner opened the door for me. I didn't even know there was a problem of getting a job. Looking backwards, it has been quite common. But I'm all for, as long as the girl can do the job up to the expectations, not that 10% of the staff should be female. Get it on your own merits and do the job. Well, look at the example we have right here, Kathy. Good for you. And the air races were such back in the mid-50s, I think, post-war, I think they've lost their flair right now, but 1955, here I was at Kingston, and some way Dorothy Rungeline, who received the Order of Canada about 3 years ago now, she is quite noted writing flying, first here, first there. In fact, I saw her just within the last month on our way home from Florida, and she sent me an email about this party tonight. She said, well, she wishes she could be here. She's 94 now, but she's doing okay. Written her 3rd book recently. But the air race, I went with Dorothy on that, and the first Canadian entry ever into the all-women's transcontinental air race. And the one magazine I've highlighted because more recently, I think in '02, well, there was some comment about, well, the lady from Australia was the first foreign entry. So so Dorothy, pen in hand, and I had already drawn to the point that, well, we were the first Canadian, non-American, and Dorothy then underlined that we have to have our passport, we have our own currency, we have this, we have that. We are Canadian. We are foreign. And anyway, a little bit of a chit-chat back and forth, but we were the first Canadian entry in this all. Anyway, 2nd year wanted me to go again, so we did. We bettered our score. We got into the first 15, but I think the amazing thing of that was to see 50-plus airplanes, and then 75-plus women up and ready to go at 5 o'clock in the morning, raring to go. Gil Rob Wilson, the editor of the Flying magazine at that time, I think, said that was the most amazing part of the whole race. But I think they were proving that light aircraft could be even women, could fly them across the country. And I think it put common purpose to light aircraft. So I don't know where that stands now, but it was certainly a great experience to have that. And likewise, Jean Hemming, who was at Rockcliffe Flying Club, and she wanted to enter the Angel Derby, which is the international north to south. The ATAR, all women's transcontinental race, is west to east, having the tailwind behind you. So Jean and I entered in 1975, and I think Jean hates to have me admit this, but we were doing very well. You had to be on the ground before 12 noon on the 24th of May. And on the 23rd of May, we had stayed in Georgia waiting for hot thunderstorm. Anyway, someone said the weather's going to be foggy in the morning. You better get up and get out of here. You're not going to make it before 12 o'clock. So we got up and went on our way. And I was doing the calculation that, Jean, we flew by Jacksonville. If that tailwind just hangs in there, we'll just make it. On the downwind at Titusville Circuit. What's that light? Night light? Official dark? It's not dark, but that's the official. We were a minute late arriving, so we were disqualified. Anyway, but flying from Hamilton down, the daylight hour, there's much less delay in the light time. And, well, that was the reality of that, but it's still a great learning lesson. And I just, having the experiences of meeting these astronauts and meeting all the wonderful people associated with aviation, the fact that when you get on an airplane, it's a time capsule. You get on, you sit X number of hours, and you get off in another country, another continent, and it's thanks to Wilbur and Orville. What has happened in the last 100 years, 103 years now? I know we did go out to the Kingston Flying Club that morning of that December 3rd, hoping everybody get off the ground on the time to recognize that first official flight. So I think that's, I still go flying to celebrate my birthday thereabout, but I go with an instructor to be a legal. And second last time was with Bob Fassold in the Chipmunk here at the Rockcliffe Museum. Greg Reynolds, who had the Stearman, he offered me at that time, well, come on, I'll take you for a ride, because when I would come into Rockcliffe from way out 16 Highway, I'd come up, pick up Greg as a high school kid, bring him into Rockcliffe, and And he then obviously grew into a great pilot and